Hey guys, what's up? This is Characters. Welcome back to the Carrot Poker Podcast. Thank you for tuning in today and for following along to my show. I'm going to do another strategy segment today for you guys, and what I want to cover today is reasons to bet. I think like any teacher of anything constantly has to deal with very frequently recurring mistakes in his students, and teachers can get frustrated by this, like, oh, people always think this, because the human brain naturally just leads to like misconceptions, patterns of misconception, if you like, in whatever field it is that it's learning. It's just very natural for these things to be recurring. And one of the most frequently recurring problems in new students in particular that I see is not understanding why they're betting or raising. It sounds like really elementary, but it's in fact a bit more complicated than it seems. There are three really good and self-sufficient reasons in poker to bet. And that's not to say that each of those reasons, when it's there to any degree, is always there to enough of a degree to be sufficient. That's not the case. But what I'm trying to say is that each of these three reasons, good reasons to bet that I'm going to go over today, can be in and of itself the sole reason that you would bet, and it can override any negatives about betting or raising in that spot. So when I say reasons to bet, let me just clarify what I mean. I actually mean reasons to bet or raise. Terminology, brush up here if you like. When we raise pre-flop, when we put money to the pot pre-flop, that's called a raise because the blinds are in there already, so we are raising the going bet, if you like. On the flop, when we bet, there is no money in the pot. Well, there's money in the pot, but there is no amount that every player has to call. People can check. And when you can check, any money you put into the pot is actually a bet. Apart from when you're in the big blind, then you'd actually be raising the big blind pre-flop. So raising is what we do when we raise a bet or raise the blinds pre-flop. Betting is what we do when it is checked to us, or there is no bet that we have to call basically after the flop. We are just betting. So reasons to bet or raise, there are three good ones and there are lots of bad ones. And I'm going to go over the good ones today and try to ingrain those a little bit and talk about sort of how they're defined, because people misdefine these good reasons to bet as well. And then after that, we'll have built up a good foundation of what we should be thinking about and what we should be looking for in a spot in order to put money into the pot voluntarily as the better or raiser. And then after that, we'll be looking at some bad reasons and using that foundation that we've built up to talk about why those reasons are actually bad and cost us EV. Because when we don't gain EV by an action, when an action is not justified in some plus EV way, there are probably going to be side effects of that action that cause it to be minus EV. So when you don't have one of the good reasons to bet, what you're probably doing is actually leaking EV in some other way by betting. So it's not just that if you bet, you're making a slight mistake, and betting is like, if you don't have one of the three reasons, it's minus EV or slightly or break even. It's probably that it's actually quite bad and quite minus EV if you're not betting for one of these three reasons. So I've been rambling a lot without even introducing what they are, so let's get into it. Reason number one to bet or raise is value. This is probably the most important thing that anyone needs to learn when they start playing like 2NL or 5NL and building their poker roll, their online poker roll, or even if they're like a live 1-2 or 2-5 player. Value betting is just like the staple of your game. It's where all the food comes from. Well, not all the food. There's also fold equity, and you've got to munch the blinds that way, and you've got to, 3-bet light and where applicable, and just make sure you're picking up enough pots pre-flop. But the massive source of your winnings will be your blue line, and that'll be extracting value from weaker opponents who are going to showdown too often, winning at showdown too infrequently, and just generally calling too much in general. So value betting, let's define it. A value bet is not a bet made when you think you have the best hand. Shock horror, that is not what value bet is. I've had students in the past say, I bet this flop for value, or I raise this flop for value. The flop comes like, I don't know, they call a 3-bet with ace jack, and the flop comes jack 6-2 rainbow, and their opponent bets, and they just raise. And I say, why did you raise for value? Okay, so what worse hands are calling? Well, maybe this hand and this hand, okay. And we establish that it's really thin anyway, and that's probably not the best way to play the hand. It's not really essential that we raise there, even if we could do it for value, and oftentimes we'll be folding out most of the hands that we're actually happy, that we have a lot of equity against, so we're happy to put more money into the pot against on later streets. So value raising that flop, even if you can get called by some combinations of like king jack and queen jack perhaps, it's just not going to be very good, because those times that we're behind, because our opponent has queens plus or a set or whatever, unlikely to be a set when he's 3-betting us pre, but it's possible. You can have a set of jacks, which is one combo, and then just all the combos of queens plus would be 18 combinations, and they are going to be a substantial part of his range as well. So when we put loads of money into the pot, just because we have the best hand the vast majority of the time, or just because we have like 70% equity against his betting range, doesn't mean we have 70% equity against his calling range should we raise. And this is a big problem. So I'm going to define value betting as follows. A value bet is a bet hero makes when hero expects to have more than 50% equity against his opponent's continuing range to that bet. That's a bet for value. Same with a raise. You can insert the word raise there as well and achieve the same effect. But yeah, it's not sufficient just to be ahead a lot against your opponent's whole range. You have to not just be ahead against the range that he's betting at you with or that he's checking to you with. You need to be ahead of the range he then continues when you put money into the pot. To take a really crude example, and the way I explain this to very new students is I'd say, okay, imagine that you have pocket kings and we're playing heads up. And my range, through some weird psychic ability in this hypothetical universe, my range is 7 deuce offsuit and pocket aces. So to go into combinations here for a second, my range contains 6 combinations of pocket aces and 12 of 7 deuce offsuit, which means that I have 7 deuce 2/3 of the time, 12 out of 18 times. So my range is weighted towards 7 deuce offsuit, and I throw in 20 big blinds pre-flop, and you have 3 choices. You can fold, you can call 20 big blinds, let's say stacks of 100 deep here, or you can raise all in for 100 big blinds. What should you do? And almost always they'll say I should just call. And they'll say why, and they'll say, well, because you're just going to fold 7 deuce and you're going to get it in with aces, and then I'll be crushed. And they'll say exactly. So in that flop spot we just looked at, where you raise the flop with top pair, weak kicker, and a 3-bet pot, you couldn't do it for value. And usually if you can't raise for value and you're trying to raise for value, you'll also find you don't fulfill any of the other reasons to bet enough to actually do it, and therefore it's minus EV, or at least not the most plus EV line, and therefore is a mistake, because we're always looking to make the most plus EV play in every given poker situation. So that's a real problem, and it's one just worth stating that when you make a value bet or raise, you really need to be ahead of the range your opponent continues with. You need to have plus 50% equity against that range, not his overall range. And yeah, you want to be in good shape when called. Otherwise, you're creating the 7 deuce aces situation where you're saying to your opponent, hey, put more money into the pot if you're beating me. If not, just fold your hand and lose the minimum now. That's a bit more crude than what it really is, and there are some advantages to raising in that spot, but they're not enough to outweigh that terrible kind of situation you're creating where your opponent will continue with mostly better hands and fold all the worse hands. What you want is for worse hands to continue, and for more money to go in the pot in later streets against those, and for no immediate more money to go in against better hands either. So just calling in that spot where you flop the top pair in the 3-bet pot just makes a hell of a lot more sense in the dry board in position, and indeed on wetter boards out of position in other situations as well. It just depends, but especially in position on that dry board. Okay. So that's the first reason to bet or raise. The second reason that you would bet or raise is as a bluff. This makes a lot of sense as well. Let's define bluff. A bluff is a bet or raise that hero makes when he expects his opponent to fold in a situation where his opponent stands to gain by not folding, basically. Okay, that's not quite it. Usually hero's making his opponent fold a better hand, equity-wise, but not always. And let me just explain that. So normally a standard bluff would be something like, hero has 6 high on the river because he's missed all his draws. He thinks he can make his opponent fold. Better missed draws, a raise high, king high, some weak pairs as well. So he goes ahead, he goes for it, he fires a bet and expects to get enough fold equity according to the bet size for that bet to be plus EV or at least break even. And so he makes a good bluff in that situation. His opponent's folding better hands. If hero actually had middle pair and was beating all the hands he expected to fold, a bluff would make absolutely no sense whatsoever, because hero would have showdown value and his hand would be in that grey zone, the kind of mediocre realm between value and bluff, where his hand is too good to bluff and not good enough to value bet, and therefore betting at all doesn't really make any sense, because you're committing the same kind of fallacy as you were before with ace jack. You're sort of making your opponent put money into the pot with all and only better hands, and that's just a terrible idea when it comes to your EV. So a bluff is normally you're making better hands fold, hands that you can't win, at showdown against. But the thing is that the earlier on we are in the hand, that's to say the closer we are to pre-flop, the further we are from showdown, obviously, and therefore the harder it is to actually realise showdown value. So there are certain times when we might only be making worse hands fold, but we still want to go ahead and bluff. One example of this would be pre-flop when, let's say we open ace queen under the gun and our opponent, a known active 3-bet or 3-bets us in the big blind. We think that his range is very polar and that he's probably, or even it could be linear, but whatever. Let's say that there's a chunk of it he's shoving over a 5-bet, over a 4-bet by us, and a chunk of it that's clearly for value, like ace king and queens plus, that's just crushing us. And then there's another chunk that he's folding to a 4-bet that we probably do much better against. The problem is if we call here, our hand just doesn't flop very well against that range that's uncapped and contains a lot of nutted combos, and it may be that we can't quite make a plus EV call. Now in that situation, if we 4-bet and think we have enough fold equity against the weaker part of his range there, 4-betting can easily be higher EV than calling, because calling is like slightly losing, and folding is also 0 EV, so that can't be better than 4-betting. So if we think we get enough fold equity here in a vacuum, and indeed in the long run with this hand with 2 great blockers, probably the best thing to do is actually 4-bet bluff. And I'm doing the finger inverted commas thing there when I say bluff, because if we're only making our opponent fold like, I don't know, his bluffs are like king queen and ace jack and ace 5 suited, then it doesn't really, why would you want to make him fold those dominated hands? The thing is that calling might actually be minus EV even against his overall range, even though it contains those hands, and therefore by making him fold those hands, we're actually achieving a really good thing. And I guess it's that kind of spot is kind of an exception, and another word that you might use for that kind of raise could be protection, and that's actually the third reason to bet, is to protect your equity. So I guess you could see it that way as well, that you raise ace queen there, you 4-bet it to protect your equity, but in fact, you know, it's different from most protection spots, because okay, so that's bluffing. I'll move on. I'll just finish bluffing, then I'll move on to protection. So bluffing is making your opponent usually fold a better hand. Certainly the closer you are to showdown, you do not want to try and make your opponent just continue all the better hands and fold all the worse hands. That makes no sense. So always be aware of your showdown value when bluffing. Make sure that you can make him fold out enough better hands in general, but there are exceptions like pre-flop when you just don't think that calling could be plus EV. Like if your opponent raises you on the flop and you think he's got loads of bluffs and you've got top pair, then obviously calling is plus EV, so turning that into a 3-bet bluff on the flop doesn't really make sense. But in the ace-queen scenario, we are not sure that calling is plus EV, and if we don't have another profitable route to continuing, we do need to turn it into a bluff, as you could say. I said that that's kind of protecting your equity, so protection is the third and least significant reason to bet, but it can be a reason in and of itself under certain circumstances, so we'll talk about what those circumstances are. Protection literally means to protect your equity in the pot, to make your opponent fold hands that, while they may be correct for him to fold, or they may not be, even better if they're not, you're still gaining EV from him folding. Let's just take an example, a crude example to start with. Why not? Let's say that I have pocket jacks and you have, give you 2 offsuit overcards. You have ace queen offsuit. So with my jacks here, I'm a slight favourite, like 56% favourite against ace queen off. And let's say that you've put in half of your stack and I shove. Now, if all the money goes in here, I'm a favourite, so I can't be complaining. I stand to win more than I stand to lose from that hand overall. I'm plus EV whatever happens. So obviously if you call, it's not the end of the world. But what I really, really love is for you to fold, because you'd be making an enormous EV mistake. You have like 44% equity, and that's huge, and you have half your stack committed. You're going to be getting 3-1 on calling off the rest of it, which means you'd only need like 25% equity to call off the rest of that stack. So if you were to fold 44% equity in a situation where you actually only need 25% share of the pot to invest the rest of your stack, you'd just be gifting me all that extra EV, all those dollars for no reason, that are actually more yours. You know, they're closer to being half yours than they are to not being yours at all. They're very nearly half yours. You have 44% equity. So to just surrender a huge amount of them when you have such a stake in them is an enormous mistake. So if you had folded there, I would have made like the most successful protection raise in the world. That's what protection is in a nutshell. Most of the time when your opponent folds to your protection bets and raises, they're not actually making a mistake. For example, the flop comes down and I have ace 4 on 4-2-2. And I bet the flop for a 2/3 pot, and you have queen jack with no backdoor draws, and you're out of position and you decide to check fold that flop, which is very reasonable. You don't have much equity. You can't necessarily represent very much. My range is uncapped, yours is capped, because you're the pre-flop caller and I'm the pre-flop raiser, and all these reasons why you shouldn't put money into the pot there. So you've not done anything wrong at all. You've just folded that hand, and so you should. But I've gained from it, because if I had checked and let you see a free turn, okay, I couldn't value bet that flop. Maybe you're not calling enough worse hands, and maybe I can't bluff it because you're not folding anything better. So you're definitely not if you're a solid player there in most situations without weird reads. I don't have those two reasons to bet, but I'm not making a mistake by betting because I have the third one, and it's such a great spot to protect my equity. So I've gained a lot there. And you were supposed to fold, but if I checked and let you realize like 20% equity against me, even just let you try and hit your 6 outs one time, that's just like, that's quite a lot of the time that you're just winning the pot when you shouldn't be. There's 47 unknown cards in the deck that could come in the turn, and 6 of them are going to make you the best hand. That's 12.7, let's call it 13% of the time that you're just going to catch up and beat me and, take a massive equity stake in that pot. I don't need to let that happen when you're folding the flop so much because I have the best hand so much, and that's the key point. That's the pinnacle of protection betting, raising. When you have the best hand loads, your opponent is likely to fold a lot anyway, and you are not going to lose much money making a protection bet from the times you're beat, because you're not beat very often at all. So a protection bet makes the most sense when you just have the best hand a lot and you have a lot of fold equity. And more importantly, or equally importantly, the hands your opponent's folding actually have a lot of equity against you, or a reasonable amount. Like, to make the best hand 13.7% of the time on the next card, that's a lot of equity. That's like, 20% equity or whatever that he has there with 2 overcards. So it's important to protect the ace 4 on the 4 loose deuce, because A, I just have the best hand a lot in that situation, say it's a late position battle like button versus big blind, and B, the hands that you are folding actually do have significant equity. A time you really wouldn't want to protect so much would be, let's say you have king queen and the flop comes down ace queen 6, and it's the same situation. You're thinking, should I bet my hand to protect my equity? Well, almost certainly not, or at least you don't have to unless you think you can get value or bluff as well for some bizarre reason. You might get value there against the fish, who knows, but you can probably get it on a later street. Anyway, I'll stop rambling off on a tangent. The reason you don't want to bet for protection there is that you don't actually have the best hand loads, because I do have ace x, and more importantly, the hands I'm folding don't have very much equity against you at all. I'm folding like pocket 8s there. It has 2 outs, not 6. It has a third of the equity that your hand had with the queen jack 2 overcards on the low 4 deuce deuce board. So protection is a decent reason to bet. It's not as convincing as value in a bluff, and you may or may not want to actually bet for protection alone. Well, value and bluff are always going to be, they're very often going to be sole reasons to bet. Protection isn't, and it's only going to be a sole reason to bet when you have a lot of fold equity, you have the best hand a lot, so you're not burning extra money times you get called, and when your opponent's folding hands with significant equity against you. What protection isn't is betting to make your opponent fold a flush draw, because he's just not really going to do that on the flop. People say, like, bet to protect against the draws. Like, it's important to extract value there when you're ahead, instead of just letting your opponent free roll to catch up. So it's good to value bet there. Or if he is going to fold, then cause him to make a big equity mistake by folding a flush draw to a pot-sized bet on the flop when he has loads of equity and probably future fold equity and implied odds and all the things that make it plus EV for him not to fold. But anyway, you're not actually protecting your equity there if you're just betting he's calling all the time. You're value betting with a slight equity edge when you've got top pair and he has a flush draw. And also denying him the price to just realise his draw really profitably for no extra expense. So in a sense, people do use the word protection to mean that, but what I mean by protection is actually making your opponent fold equity. Protecting your stake in the pot, claiming the whole pot for yourself when the cards only dictate that 80% or 75% of that pot is yours based on your pot equity against that of your opponent. Okay, that's 3 good reasons to bet out the way. Those are the only ones. If there's another reason and it's not accompanied by one of those 3, or one or more of those 3, then you shouldn't bet, basically. That's the rule. So let's go through some potential reasons to bet very quickly here, because I'm on a schedule and I have to wrap this up. But I'm going to go through 4 potential reasons to bet here that are basically bad in and of themselves, but maybe could be very slight bonuses when paired with the 3 good reasons to bet. So the first is information. This is the most common one you hear. I bet to find out where it was at. Why is it a bad idea to raise ace jack on that flop? The first example we looked at, the jack 6-2 rainbow board in the 3-bet pot, to find out where you're at. Because when you find out where you're at, you've already lost so much EV by doing that any information you gain is not going to recoup enough EV. Okay, your opponent 3-bet you on the flop and you know he only does that with a set. Great, you found out your opponent has a set, but you've still bloated the pot with ace jack against that set. You've already lost a massive amount of big blinds because you raised a c-bet in a 3-bet pot just to find that out. And okay, maybe it's possible there that you lose a bit less the times that your opponent has a set, because otherwise you call down flop, turn and river against them, fine, but that's just one branch and your opponent has a range and not just sets. And all those times that your opponent has bluffs, if you're calling down flop, turn and river, the reason for that is obviously that you think that he can be bluffing there sometimes. And so when you raise the flop, you're just stopping your opponent from bluffing with all those weaker hands. And even if you save a little bit of money by raising flop against a set to find out where you're at, and it's not that much because you've already invested a load of money just to find that out, to get that information, even if that information is perfect and it does actually put you in a position where you save EV in that one branch, you still lose EV in the tree because you shut down all your opponent's bluffs those times that he's actually just got a weaker hand, and you just ruin the EV for all those other branches on the tree where he's bluffing. So information betting and raising just doesn't really make much sense at all. It can be a bonus, like if you've got a really good read or whatever and you already have other reasons to bet, but it's not in and of itself ever a good reason to bet. The second one would be deception. Like, this can be useful if it makes sense from an EV standpoint. Like, if you don't need to value bet the flop because the pot's already huge and you can cause your opponent to spew in the next street by checking and not lose anything from that, then okay, that deception is like a bonus factor, but it's only good because you didn't need to value bet. If you had to value bet, then it would have been terrible. If you had to build that pot, then checking just to mislead your opponent is awful. One terrible thing that fish do, and you'll see this all the time, is that they'll flop a set like the nuts and they'll just check, flop and turn. And they'll fail to build the pot, then they'll make like a river bet and they'll only win one bet from a hand they should have won 3 from or something like that. Or they'll check twice, their opponent will have a flush draw, get there on the river, and then they'll stack them and then they'll get all mad about how their opponent has a draw. Or something like that. It's ridiculous. But the deception that they gain by checking a couple of streets just is totally irrelevant. Like, it spirals into complete insignificance when you compare it to the EV that they lose in that way by not getting value. So deception can be good if you don't need to be value betting or bluffing, or you have another reason to bet, but otherwise it can cost your EV massively. If you're making huge EV mistakes just for the purpose of deception alone, then that's just really bad. The next one is metagame. People will say things to me like, I didn't fold the flop because otherwise he'll think he can just push me around. You don't know what he's going to think. You have no idea that your opponent is... If your opponent is jumping to the conclusion that you are now a bitch who's going to fold every time just because you folded one flop, then he's just irrational and crazy. And you can just look to exploit him by not folding in future if you actually had that read. But what you're more likely doing when you make that comment is you're just assuming a bunch of metagame that's not there. Don't raise the flop to show your opponent who's boss. You have no idea if he's going to just lie down and respect that. You have no idea if he's going to play back at you more or less because of it, and you should be thinking about whether it's likely to be a profitable bluff or a profitable protection raise or a profitable value raise. That's why you raise the flop, not to show him that you're the top dog or to cause him to do things in future against you, or because you think that he'll try and run you over if you don't. All of these reasons are just kind of guesswork, and even if they were true, they're not even reasons to do it. Even if you knew your opponent was going to start folding loads to you, or that's a bad example. Let's say you knew your opponent was going to start bluffing you loads if you folded once or twice on the flop. Just fold once or twice and then bluff catch down. That's a much better way to exploit him than just like denying him the opportunity to make that huge mistake. So metagame, like causing your opponent to do something because he thinks that you think that, often it's unreliable, it's inaccurate. And even if it is reliable, it's not always that linked to EV. The thing that makes value, bluff, and protection really, really good reasons to bet is that they are very closely tied to the EV of your decision. information deception metagame, or because you've got some psychic urge that villain is going to do this. These are not actually linked to EV at all, or they are very, very slightly maybe in some branches, but not in most, or something like that. Remember, the EV tree is like a big thing, and it's not just one branch. It's not just that one branch where you fold and he sees you fold. Then he exploits you, and then you continue to fold because you don't want to use the read that you've got that you probably don't even have because it's not real. That was quite a rant. But you get where I'm coming from. The more centrally tied to EV the reason is, the more of a reason is to bet or raise, and it can be a reason on its own. Value, bluff, protection. The less tied it is to betting or raising, the less you want to bet or raise for that reason. But it could be like a bonus reason, maybe. Like the bonus ball in the lottery. No one wants that ball, but they'll take it if they've already got 5 numbers. Alright, this has been Characters for the Carrot Poker Podcast. I'm going to leave it there for today, and I'll be back with more segments very soon. Going on holiday to Amsterdam, so looking forward to that in a few days. So I'm going to take a little break from all the poker stuff that I do, and then I'll come back refreshed next week with another episode for you guys. If you want to get in touch about coaching, then please send me an email at admin@carrotcorner.com, or check out the website at carrotcorner.com and look at my coaching pages, packages, that kind of thing. If you want to give me some feedback about the podcast, I'd love to hear from you guys. Let me know what you think of it. Let me know on iTunes. Let me know on YouTube. Send me an email. Give me private feedback. Go on my website and leave some feedback in the podcast section there. Suggestions, comments for the future are all welcome. Hope you guys are enjoying it, and I hope it's useful for your game. Please continue to improve, work hard on your game, and follow along, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now, guys.
The way you slip